Mustafa, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
Thank you so much for having me. Jazakallah khair.
Mustafa, I'm wondering, why do you think Canadians should be concerned about the spread of far-right extremism and white supremacism in Canada?
Well, I think for a variety of reasons. I think the first reason is that at the hands of white supremacist groups, at the hands of those who have been motivated by white supremacist ideology, we've actually had the death and the killing of some of our brothers and sisters. And that's both domestically and internationally. In Canada, obviously, on January 29, 2017, Alexander Bissonnette walked into the Quebec City Mosque. He had spent a lot of time online reading about various xenophobic, Islamophobic, white supremacist stuff, and then killed, 6 of our brothers. More recently, on September 12th, 2020, a man walked up to the IMO Masjid here in Etobicoke, not too far away from where we're sitting right now, took out a knife and slit the throat of one of our brothers, Brother Muhammad Aslam Zabas, and we pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants them all the status of shuhada. The reality is that we cannot, and the man who attacked Brother Muhammad Aslam Zabas has online affiliations to a group called O9A, which is, and I know this sounds kind of unrealistic when I say it, but it's actually a white supremacist cult with deep affection towards Hitler. And the reality is that these groups simply can't be allowed to continue to operate with impunity in Canada, because it's not just the Alexander Bissonnette, it's not just the attack that happened at the IMO. It's the reality is that we have 300 of these groups operating in Canada
that we know of.
That sort of counterterrorism experts are paying attention to. These are groups like the Base. The Base is a organization that has very deep penetration within the Canadian Armed Forces. Their members are explicitly Amtwaffen, in the sense that they are very pro-Nazi, and they very much target in their training, in their practices, the Muslim community.
So,
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, it's not just them. There's also like the Three Percenters. The Three Percenters are a group, a militia group that have chapters across Canada, including in Ontario, but especially in Alberta. They train with live ammunition. They build bombs. They practice for this apocalyptic showdown with the Canadian Muslim community. And it's absolutely critical that we make sure that these groups cannot be allowed to function. Because let me tell you this, if I was out, if you and I were up training in the mountains of Alberta, building bombs, practicing with machine guns, we wouldn't be allowed to do that. We're saying these groups that are doing this shouldn't be allowed to exist. A group that's calling itself the Base because they see that as the English translation of Al-Qaeda and are not on the list doesn't make any sense.
So I guess the follow-up question that I have to you is, if we are, Muslims have been concerned for since September 11, 2001, but even before that, about the way the government has perceived them and has kind of gone after them, online in their mosques and their communities, to see if they're associated with terrorism. And now, are we going to suggest the same thing for these white supremacist groups, far-right groups as well?
This is such an important question. I'm somebody who's a longtime skeptic of the way that terrorism and the regimes of counterterrorism have been deployed against members of the Muslim community. In fact, my forthcoming book that I wrote while I was at Osgoode Hall Law School as a visiting professor is explicitly on CVE, countering violent extremism.
Okay, that's great.
And how CVE gets deployed both in the legal and in the political sense to stigmatize and demonize members of the Muslim community. That's why one of the key asks in our National Action Plan is a fundamental review of the way that CSIS is approaching these questions of terrorism, the way that our national security agencies are approaching these questions of terrorism, because without that kind of critical eye, we're not going to ultimately solve towards the key problems. In other words, the solution is not more law enforcement. The solution is a critical approach to dismantling these groups, but also to make sure that we're dismantling the problematic elements
Mhm.
that led to the stigmatization of entire communities
Mhm.
within our national security agencies.
Mhm. How do you deal with the ideology? Because, a lot of the ideas that are espoused by these far right groups, if they're not violent, because some of them are not explicitly violent. So if they're not violent, then some of them are actually part of the mainstream political conversations that we see in Europe, in the United States, and, partly in Canada as well.
Mhm. I think that's $1 million question. I don't know if we have the full answer to it. Inshallah, we pray that we develop ways to combat. I think
Mhm.
shows like Let the Quran Speak are such an important part of adding and thinking about ways that we can fight back against their discourse.
Mhm.
And we know that education is probably a key part of this. Obviously, our plan to dismantle white supremacist groups is looking very critically at dismantling these 300 violent, dangerous groups.
Okay, so you're not looking at
But
online discourse that's not violent.
no, we're not
Doesn't seem
looking
like
at
it's espousing
we're not looking
violence.
at in our plan. We're not looking at sort of the person who says, "I'm not sure if I don't like immigrants,"
Okay.
or "I'm not sure if I like immigrants." That's not our primary focus.
Mhm.
Our primary focus is going after groups like the base, like the 3%ers, like Les Mutes, like others that are very dangerous. The Northern Guard,
Mhm.
the
And we know the
Klan.
Canadian government only has 2 white supremacist groups on its
Right.
list.
And NCCM worked very hard with Minister Goodale's office to have those 2 groups,
Okay.
Combat 18 and Blood and Honor, listed.
Mhm.
To give you perspective, a few years back, one of the members of Combat 18 walked into a Calgary convenience store, broke a glass on the floor, and took out the eye of a sick gentleman who was working at the store,
Mhm.
thinking that man might be Muslim.
Mhm.
So, these kinds of groups shouldn't be allowed to exist. They shouldn't be allowed to organize. They shouldn't be allowed to militarize. Is sort of a key part of that plan, but it doesn't help us necessarily fully address the key questions that you're asking about. What are the roots of this? Where is this
Mhm.
coming from? Because we don't know fully, whether
And what's the best way to counter it?
right.
Right?
We don't know fully. Is this coming from? A lot of people have proposed that perhaps economic conditions. People feel like they're losing their jobs and they're not, being able to access, what people in the 60s had.
Mhm.
And so they're turning their anger and attention towards immigrant communities. Some people propose that it's entirely ideological. We don't know if we have the best answer.
Mhm. Just as we don't have the best answer in terms of, Al Qaeda and ISIS, Daesh,
100%.
those kinds of groups as well.
No,
We're
and
not
we
really
don't-
sure why people join those groups.
Right. And we don't pretend to know exactly. At the end of the day, if I really think about it, what would, even if, being members of a white supremacist group, but what would actually possess somebody to walk into a masjid, take out a gun and start shooting people?
Mhm.
I can't begin to understand or begin to imagine that.
Mhm.
And that's why we need more research.
Mhm.
We need more people to undertake that, to research that, to analyze that. And that's part of why what our ask is to government is to increase funding for greater research into these kinds of questions.
How has the Canadian government responded?
Alhamdulillah, it's been pretty well.
Okay.
Jagmeet Singh, the leader of Canada's NDP, endorsed the National Council of Canadian Muslims, our action plan
Mhm.
to dismantle white supremacist groups. We've been having very productive meetings with the Minister of Public Safety, Bill Blair, and we've been having very productive meetings as well with the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office to try to determine ways that we can dismantle these groups, and as well make sure that in our dismantling of these groups, that it's seen through this lens of civil liberties. It's seen through this critical lens to make sure that we're not reproducing a problematic system.
Yeah, and violating freedom of expression, freedom of speech.
100%.
Yes, freedom of association as well.
These are critical. I mean, as somebody that's a lawyer and thinks about civil liberties, obviously in our Bill 21 fight, our major focus is on thinking about the civil liberties of communities. It's critical that in our battle to dismantle these very terrifying groups that have led to the deaths of members of our communities, that we're not doing something that ultimately will hurt the fabric of our society.
So is Prime Minister Justin Trudeau coming up with a plan? Is that what's happening
So he's
behind the scenes?
committed to doing more.
Okay.
Exactly what that more will look like, we're still working through. One of the things that we've been asking for in terms of online hate regulation, he has committed to, and you can go and check that out in terms of what that's going to look like. And we've been working back and forth with government on sort of finessing what the exact language of that could look like. But in terms of the other things, in terms of a national action plan to dismantle these 300 groups that already exist, that part is still sort of being worked through.
I like that there are so many different groups that are involved in writing this letter. How important is coalition building?
Super important. I mean, it's not always easy.
Yeah.
And, but it is something that I think is important. We have to know, based on our Quranic values, and this is obviously I'm not a mufassirin or anything like that, but when we're told, Ya Ahl al-Kitab, ta'alaw ila kalimatin sawa'in baynana wa baynakum, come together on this common word between you. To us, one element, and of course that's not exactly what the Quranic ayah is referring to, but one element that we're trying to come together on is this methodology of defeating this problem that is affecting the Jewish community. It's affecting the Sikh community. It's affecting the Baha'i community. It's affecting Black and Indigenous communities. Dismantling that by standing together and holding hands is really where I believe that we need to go.
Mustafa, what do you think the average Muslim should do when they hear about your plan and they understand that white supremacist groups are rising? There's more of them. What sort of action should they take?
I mean, I don't know if there's an easy answer. I often wake up every morning wondering the same kind of thing. I think that there's a few things. The first thing is, I think, keep the people who have been the victims in your dua, keep them in your thoughts. I can tell you that, just recently, earlier this year, I met with Ayman Derbali. Ayman was one of the victims of the Quebec City mosque shooting, and that he was shot numerous times in the back trying to protect people as they were fleeing, and now he's paralyzed. And it's incumbent on us as a community to not forget about their sacrifice, to keep them in our dua, and also to make sure that they're financially supported. So making sure that the direct victims, in whatever way you can, if it's $1, if it's $10, support those because honestly, that could have been us. It could have been any of us who come to the masjid. Could have been your grandpa, could have been your aunt, could have been your uncle, could have been your son. So I think that's one, is remember those who have been actually affected. The second is educate yourself. Learn more about what this challenge is, what this problem is. Go on Google, type in 3%ers in Canada, type in the base in Canada. Learn about these groups that are operating in Canada, because literacy and education is so important here to help us figure out how to respond. And the last thing is, if you're so inclined and you think that our national action plan is important, go onto our website, www.nccm.ca, and send us a message that you want to come onto our phone bank. We've been having people call across Canada to their elected officials saying, we think you need to take action on this. We think that things need to happen. We've had thousands of phone calls made from coast to coast. And if you'd like to be part of that movement, feel free to send us an email.
Mustafa, thank you very much for your thoughts and for the excellent work that you're doing with NCCM.
Thank you so much for having us.
You're welcome.
If you enjoyed this video, click like and subscribe. And please donate to support our work at QuranSpeaks.com.